Hello, friends. I'm Devendra, your host for the podcast, and you're listening to Life of a Researcher Stories Beyond UI. Hello, friends. Welcome to this episode of Life of Researcher Stories Beyond UI. And in this episode, we have with us Professor Sarang Dev. Professor Sarang is Professor of Operations Management and Executive Director of Max Institute of Healthcare Management at Indian School of Business. Professor Sarang often used to visit Arvind Eye Hospital, Madurai for his research work, and that is when I got to know him. He is a well published researcher and a very good teacher. Through this interview, I hope we'll get to know him more as a person. Welcome, Professor Sarang. Glad to have you with us on this podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Devendra. Thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, sir. So, to start with, let me ask you the first question. You were trained as a chemical engineer at IIT Bombay. What prompted your decision to get into academia, and how did you develop your interest in specifically healthcare research?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a question I often get. I suppose there was always some inclination towards academics from an early age. Although, you know how it is, we don't always reconcile various different thought processes. So, while I may have had academic inclinations, if someone asked me, what do you want to be? I would, say, take up a corporate job or be an engineer. But towards, I guess, later part of the engineering experience, I started realizing that although I have academic interests, I may not want to pursue that in engineering. And as is often the case in India, you say, okay, if I'm not going to pursue engineering, what are other options? I didn't want to go into IT, and so then MBA or management was the obvious choice. Prepared for CAT, got through, got selected, and then did my MBA from IIM Ahmedabad. After that, I still remember the first class I took in operations. I was really, really interested and hooked onto the topic, on the subject. Um, Tried very hard to get an operations job coming out of IIM Ahmedabad. It was very hard. There were very few operations jobs, and most of them were in the manufacturing sector and quote unquote not very well paying.
Mhm.
Luckily, the job that I got, which was in consulting, involved a lot of operations and supply chain thinking. Um, and it turns out that most of my consulting work in those 2 years was with a pharmaceutical client. So
Mhm.
that's a roundabout answer to your question of how I got interested in healthcare. And when I decided to apply for PhD and then I got admitted, I thought I'll do my PhD thesis in pharmaceutical biotech industry, using that as the context.
Mhm.
Little did I know that that's not how PhD works. Very few academic PhDs are focused on an industry. But then, because this was my background, I started researching what are the good topics, and I picked up vaccine supply chain. It had some elements of production uncertainty, production yields that I had studied, sort of encountered in my consulting career. And from then on, I think it was a natural journey, because the more I read, the more I realized that product is a small part of healthcare delivery. A larger part is services. And so I tried to then use my operations training to think more on service delivery rather than product delivery or supply chain. Yeah.
Good to know that. After completing PhD at UCLA, you worked at Kellogg's School of Management for a couple of years. So,
Hmm.
now after doing PhD in USA and then again working from couple of there for a couple of years, no, I mean it's difficult to shift back to India. So, what were your considerations when you decided to shift back to India and join ISB?
Yeah. Not a unique problem. I'm pretty sure a lot of people who go to the US or any other country for higher education are constantly kind of thinking of, when is the time to move back? Should one move back? And they're kind of stuck in between. When I went for a PhD, I was already married, so I went along with my wife, and we always had this plan that we'll finish the PhD and come back.
Mhm.
And sort of the only schools that I thought of coming back to India at that time where I am Ahmedabad, where I had some experience, and then possibly I am Bangalore, given the location, right? Turns out that after 4 years of PhD, I got an offer from a school that was considered a reputed school, and you can't just say no. Um, so the 4 years at Kellogg were actually 4 additional years, right? Beyond our initial schedule. And the main reason to come back, both for me and my wife, were just family reasons. Parents, even at that time, they were kind of growing old, and we could foresee health concerns. The health delivery system in India for elderly care is not very good. It wasn't existing then. Today it exists, but it's still not very good. And so it's responsibility of children to kind of step up. So that was the main reason. It was nothing very lofty.
No, but still an important consideration for many of us.
Yeah.
So you have been so one of the things which I have always observed that no you have received best faculty award year after year at ISB. But then this teaching is a different skill set which we are usually not trained while we are doing PhD or even any other course. So how did you prepare yourself for this role in academics?
Yeah, no, you're right. I think most PhDs don't explicitly train their students for teaching, and the good ones, right? Quote again, quote unquote, good ones make it a point to not have too much teaching for their PhD students. Although I think uh, in India, maybe, and in some North American public universities, it is almost compulsory for PhD students to teach, maybe undergrads at some point in time. But at UCLA, where I did my PhD, the most that I did was a teaching assistant for some of the courses.
Mhm.
And most people tend to look at teaching as a necessary evil, that we need to do this, but the main goal is research, and focus is research. So no, a lot of it is just learning by doing. You kind of take advice of your senior colleagues when you become a faculty member, learn from their experience, and then hope that the institution that you have joined has a system set up for junior faculty. So at Kellogg, there was a very well structured system. Junior faculty who joined would usually teach a core course, as we call it in business academia. And so it's a basic course that all MBAs have to take. It is very well designed. You can take material from your colleagues, present the same material, case
Mhm.
studies, slides. So very little preparation of that sort is involved. But I mean, those who may not be aware of MBA teaching, despite a lot of preparation, there's a lot of effort that goes inside the classroom. How do you make the class engaging? How do you make it relevant to MBAs? And you
Mhm.
can't be teaching your own research directly in the classroom, definitely not in a core course. So a lot of that comes by just observing other people. Again, at Kellogg, there was a system where you sat in a senior colleague's class and kind of observed how things go before you actually
Mhm.
taught. I think despite all that, first time teaching is very hard, and most people, unless you're exceptional, most people will fail.
Mhm.
uh, so I went through the rite of passage, and in the first year I realized that I should be putting a lot more effort.
Mhm.
And so then after that, I think one realizes what's the direction of effort needed, how much preparation is adequate preparation, so on and so forth. So I think if you do it many times, and if you are conscious of what you're doing, I think it's not that hard also. I guess there is, at the core, there is this thing of, do you really care for your students?
Mhm.
You may not enjoy, I mean, for example, I don't enjoy teaching. I don't look forward to teaching, let me put it that way.
Mhm.
But if I'm inside the classroom, I can't not be doing a good job, and I can't not be ensuring learning for students. So then you kind of pick up on your mistakes and figure out a way to correct them.
So the core of this whole teaching process is now to think well for your students.
I
Uh,
think so. You got to care for them, and you got to focus on the learning aspect, right? So I was just talking to one of my junior faculty colleagues 2 days ago, who is going to teach for the first time this year. And I said, when you start teaching, your focus is on teaching.
Mhm.
That I have a certain set of slides, I have some material, I need to get through that material for 2 hours. That's teaching.
Mhm.
But if you have that under your belt, if you're very, very extremely well prepared, right, then you in the classroom, you can focus on the learning,
Mhm.
right, which is taking the student's perspective and say, are they getting what I'm saying? Why are they not getting? Why is that student having that expression at this point? So I'm pretty sure that student is confused about this issue. And
Mhm.
if that student is confused, then other people will be confused. And so you pause. So those things will come if you're sort of outcome oriented, right? Not input oriented. Teaching is an input,
Mhm.
whereas learning is an outcome. So if you are outcome oriented, you will naturally start focusing on those things.
Good perspective. So, since you compared the setup at Kellogg's, um, can you reflect a bit on how PhD courses are different in India and the West? And I mean, what
Mm.
are the gaps which we need to fill at our end here?
Mm. Yeah, so I mean, to be honest, my experience with PhD programs in India is only at ISB
Mm-hmm.
and possibly very remotely at IIM uh, when I was at IIM Ahmedabad. ISB FPM, as we call it, the Fellow Program in Management, is structured very much around a typical North American PhD. So, very similar in that the first 2 years are purely coursework. So, I think the legacy that we are dealing with here is most PhD programs in North America allow undergraduates to directly join the PhD program, which means they have not done graduate level coursework, which in India is different, right? One assumes a bachelor's, then master's, then even some MPhil, and then PhD.
Mm-hmm.
So this MPhil part is combined within PhD in North American universities and at ISB similarly. So first 2 years you don't think too much about research. You focus on methods. Now, of course, that is changing. I'm given to understand that as things become more competitive, students are starting to work on research earlier and earlier. But the classic model was you can't start doing research unless you know the methods really well. Now, for a moment to contrast that with IIM Ahmedabad, at least when I was there, which is almost 20 years ago, I know that the first year of FPM coursework was common with the PGDM coursework, right? I think there was some logic to that. The understanding was even though you are doing a PhD, you need to understand basics of management, and so you need to learn everything that the MBAs learn because otherwise, how will you teach them?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that makes a lot of sense. Again, just before our conversation, I was talking to someone from ICER. He's a current student and in math, and he wants to move to management. And we were discussing similar issues. And I said he was himself aware. He said, if I want to be in business academia, I at least need to know what business is. So I may do an MBA first and then work for some years and then do PhD. So I think that logic of having first course work of FPM being common to MBAs makes sense. But the trade off is that it dilutes a little bit of methodology preparation. And I don't know what the right balance is.
So, a little while back, we just discussed about teaching, and when we have a good teacher or we have good offerings from someone, we sort of start looking up to those people. You know? So,
Mm-hmm.
in your career, were there people that you looked up to, or even now you look up to, to
Yeah.
I mean, to create your own path? So, if you can share maybe something about them and any specific incidences that are from your memory.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's correct. I think a lot of this academic journey is about, I guess, corporate journeys also is about finding the right mentor and the right kind of people to look up to. Um, Going back to IM days, like I said, the first class I took in operations, I was really excited. So, various operations faculty from IIM Ahmedabad got an opportunity to sit in their class, tried to work with them. It was very hard as an MBA student. You're not really working with them, but managed to do a project or two that resulted in a case study, and you got a glimpse into what the life of a faculty member outside the classroom is.
Mhm.
Um, and when I was looking for those operations job from IMA, I did interact with a lot of faculty, and when I was then thinking about academia, they told me very honestly that the research that is done in business schools around the world is very different from what we do at IMA. And again, this is 20 years ago. I know that things are changing now. So be very cognizant of this fact that don't model your goals and ambitions based on what we do, because we do very different things. This is the faculty at IMA saying, but most of them were well trained in North America. Some of them were tenured faculty in North American schools and had decided to come back, possibly for very different reasons at that time, more on institution building, nation building, etc. But that was my first glimpse, and I really looked up to all of them at that time. And then when I went for my PhD, I looked for an advisor, not based on academic credentials or stature as much as just someone is a good human being and is a good mentor who again cares about their students. And I was very fortunate to find my advisor with whom I worked very closely for 4 years. And he wasn't even working in healthcare at that time. uh,
Mhm.
so I was very fortunate that he allowed that flexibility for me to explore whatever I wanted to do, yet
Mhm.
train me very well and instill in me core principles of research, right? And it's hard to articulate those. It's not mathematical prowess, it's just basic curiosity. I mean, I remember coming out of those meetings always feeling good, right? That, oh, I learned something today, or I contributed to the learning, because the advisor would come in genuinely not knowing, genuinely on the same road of discovery as the student is,
Mhm.
as against some other advisors who would know where things are going at the back of their mind, and they just kind of leading the student along a path. Whereas the one that I experienced was a sort of a joint discovery process, and that gives you a lot of ownership and initiative. So and I think then the strive for perfection, right? So you kind of work on the paper for 10, 15, 20 versions of the draft before you even find it's ready to submit. uh, so those are the things that I learned, and I try to do them as best as I can myself.
Mhm. Okay. So you are also guide to doctoral students. So what are the
Mhm.
most basic or essential skills that you look out for in the doctoral students they should have to start with, and maybe how should they nurture them before getting into a doctoral program?
Mm,
Um,
mm,
if you can reflect on that, and maybe also how did you prepare yourself for this doctoral journey? Uh,
mm, mm, mm. Yeah, I don't remember. So the second part of the question is easy to answer. I don't remember myself preparing in any
okay.
particular way. Like I said, I was doing consulting, and I worked for 2 years, and there was a small break, and after that I immediately joined the program.
Mhm.
So I did talk to some people who were in the PhD program during my application process, and later on after I got my admission offers, to understand what sort of coursework there is, because I had heard that the coursework is very technical, and it's technical even for someone who comes from an engineering background. So try to read a little bit, just refresh your memory on some mathematical uh, you know uh, aspects coming from corporate world, but very little. I mean, I went with a fairly blank slate. What I think are good attributes of an incoming PhD student, um, one, again, I think going back to basics is just curiosity. Like I'm genuinely curious about something. I want to know. and the ability to frame questions. I think this is often overlooked
Yeah.
because, as I was saying earlier, a lot of methodology courses prepare you for the methods that will be used to answer a question, but there isn't a course that will train you to ask questions. Either
Mhm.
that comes intrinsically, or that's the role that typically an advisor would play, if there is luxury of time. Because students framing questions, 9 out of 10 times are going to be silly questions or too ambitious or infeasible, etc. So then the advisor needs to have the patience and the luxury of time to make the student go back again and again. But that is something that I would ask those who are thinking of an academic career, say, do you naturally ask many questions? If not, then it's unclear if you're curious, and then why do you want to do a PhD, right? Why do you want to get into research? uh, I think the second attribute is, and this I think I've learned and appreciated only over time, is just grunt work. I mean, we hear all this Thomas Edison saying that success is 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration.
Mhm.
Different people realize it in different ways, but I think it's largely correct. There is a spark here and there, but not very often, and definitely not in my experience in business academia, will you wake up in the morning and say, I dreamt of this and now I have a new theory. It doesn't work that way. And I think those accidents, if they happen, also happen to a prepared mind. So you got to do a lot of background work to be ready to receive some inspiration, right?
Mhm.
So that is often overlooked, and maybe more so in India, if I dare to say, because I think the perception of academics in India is a very, like, a pure perception, right? That someone is sitting under a tree and thinking very hard and deep, and then some wisdom is imparted. I don't think in today's world that's how it works. It's a profession, and for you to be successful in your profession, you got to have some good habits and good approach and discipline, dedication,
Mhm.
etc. And a lot of that is going to happen alone. So that's the other thing that I would ask people to think through, is this is a very solitary journey.
Mhm.
uh, you may interact with your fellow PhD students in the same year or year before or after, etc., but they're on a different journey, right? It's their journey and you have your journey, and you may sometimes kind of meet on these journeys and cross paths, etc., but you have to be extremely self-motivated, self-starter and entrepreneurial. And
Mhm.
I don't think people realize that enough at the beginning. So I think after that, this whole, are you good in mathematics? Are you good in statistics? I think that all comes much later. I think it's secondary.
Mhm.
And the ability to synthesize. So again, this is something I've realized, realized more and more as I've progressed, is you can solve one problem very well, you can answer one question, you can write one paper, but even when you're writing that one paper, do you truly understand the literature? Are you able to kind of take 10 papers and synthesize the evidence from those 10 papers and say, that's why this thing is not known yet, and this is the next frontier and I'm contributing to it?
Mhm.
Unless you have that in your paper, the paper is no good, irrespective of how much mathematics or methodological rigor there is. And it's hard to do initially. I think some fields do it better than others.
Mhm.
I have some exposure to public health and social sciences, etc., where an incoming student comes with a proposal, and that proposal requires you to have read through literature and framed questions. I think that's good discipline. We don't have it in management. I don't know if other schools have it. um, as a result, people come in too fresh.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, sir, you also play laws, I mean, play a different role. I mean, maybe this is your main role at ISB as a researcher, right?
Hmm.
So in this role, you must have traveled to multiple places, because I've seen your research, and it's about tuberculosis and vaccines.
Hmm.
Some studies are from Africa, some are in southern part of India, some are in northern part of India.
Hmm.
I'm sure you must have traveled to some of those places.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
when we travel to different places, what happens is we evolve as a person. I mean, something happens or some interaction with someone happens, and that's kind of a different
Hmm.
moment for us, and we
Hmm.
are a bit transformed. So, have you had such kind of moments in your life? And if you can, if yes, then can you share some of those anecdotes?
Hmm. Yeah, no, no, I agree with that. I should preface by saying, though, that the approach that I took for my research is not very conventional in business academia. I don't think field research or travel is that big a part of most
Mm-hmm.
research careers or research portfolios of people, because secondary data is easily available.
Yeah.
You can work on your computers, etc., or write theoretical papers, which I have also done, to be honest. But I do believe that a lot of good ideas come from practice, right? So you earlier talked about people who have influenced you, and we had a very senior faculty in my UCLA department, very well known, very respected, who had this ability to take a broad view and synthesize where the field is going, etc. And I used to go and just chat with him once in a while, although he was not on my committee or advisor. He was close to retirement at that time. And he once asked me, what do you think of three things: teaching, research, and practice? What is most important?
Mm-hmm.
And I of course try to be diplomatic and give answers. Oh, it depends, and sometimes it's no, no, no. Of these three, only practice is important, because there cannot be any teaching and research without practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was remarkable for someone who had been an academic for who knows how many years. But looking back, he had done a lot of work in conjunction with practice. So why am I going into that? Is you can't learn about practice truly unless you are there. There is this term in lean operations. It's called GEMBA. It's a Japanese term which says go there and see.
Okay.
So when we think about process improvement, and I use this example in the class, there's this notion that people are sitting in their offices in front of computers and creating a strategic roadmap for process improvement and quality improvement. But philosophy is, if someone says I have a problem, go there and see what the problem is.
Mm-hmm.
And given my consulting background, I had appreciated that already. I spent a lot of time on shop floors and fermentation plants trying to reduce manufacturing costs, etc. So I mean, as a junior faculty, I did a lot of crazy things and very risky things. I went to Uganda and Zambia and spent several weeks there without any real connections, just talking to people, introducing who I am. And I was no one. I was just an assistant professor with no credibility, knows nothing about public health, and a lot of false starts, a lot of wasted time. But then somewhere something clicks, and one connection leads to another. So yeah, I mean, those experiences were very formative, because every time that someone denied a data request, you learned why they're denying that data request. If I'm talking to a country head of lab systems, I want to understand what their perspective is. Why should they
Mm-hmm.
share their data with me? And you then naturally start learning the language and say, first let me try and understand what your problems are, and is there a way I can help you understand and solve. We'll talk about data later, right? Or you go to these clinics in remote areas and really see how healthcare workers function. Why are there delays in, let's say, sample transportation or results being delivered? And you think of a picture where there are muddy roads flooded with rainwater and a truck is stuck, etc. And when you're on the ground, you realize that's not really the problem. The problem is that all these samples are piled up in a clinic and there's no one to take them to the lab, right? There are procedural delays. And so when you are creating mathematical models, you cannot create a mathematical model that has long transportation time, because the transportation time is only 1 day. Yet it takes 30 days for the results to come back. So then the mathematical model has to capture the fact that samples are accumulating, and its availability of transport, which is the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So then you create a stochastic model for transport availability. So it helps, of course, it helps to be on the ground and be able to then capture some of that in your research.
Mm-hmm.
I talked about very concrete things of being on the field and then informing research, but
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also worth saying that you learn many other things, right? So you it's hard to translate everything in research, but when you go into an organization like Arvind, I mean, you just realize it's truly inspirational, even if you're not a spiritual person, which those organizations are sometimes very heavy on. But you talk to a frontline worker in Arvind, and it is difficult for you to not be inspired and curious of how does that happen? How does a frontline worker feel so empowered? Or you talk to an ASHA worker in Bihar, and who's talking about her son's education, and you say, "Oh wow!" I mean, so now I wonder how ASHAs are, self-selected into this profession. What makes a good ASHA and what doesn't? So there are other ways in which you change as a person.
Hmm. With this, I will come to the last question, and last question is about failures, which we often don't hear about, because often on LinkedIn also we'll keep on seeing the success stories, but
Yeah.
failure, I feel, is kind of an integral part of our journey, and maybe that's where from our major learning comes.
Mhm.
So can you share some of your failures and maybe what were the learning from them?
Yeah, several of them. Um, you're right. I mean, even within the scientific publishing process, there is already a reporting bias, right? You're more likely to report a result than a null result.
Mm-hmm.
So that's baked into the entire system. No, several failures of different kinds, right? So, I mean, I worked on a problem in my first summer in the PhD program with someone who would then later become my advisor. And, at the end of the summer, I thought I had something, and the advisor thought this was not very interesting. So we just abandoned it. That was my first. And it took me some time to realize what was wrong. There was nothing wrong with that model. It just was not good enough, according to my advisor. And so then you realize, okay, so there is something called as good enough,
Okay.
interesting enough. So that you may spend 2 3 months working on something and get some quote unquote results or proofs, but there's a sniff test of whether it is interesting or good enough. So that was first minor failure, I would say. I talked about spending time in African countries and not being able to get access to data, not getting
Mm-hmm.
access to decision makers. And these were trips where I would spend 3 4 weeks and be in my hotel room most of the time, and try and get appointments with people. And at the end of the 3 4 weeks, I will come back to the US with nothing to show for.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like the life stops, so you have to still do your teaching, you have to still do your research, you have to publish papers, you have to do refereeing work, etc., etc. So all of that is happening in parallel. So that was interesting experience of failure of different kind. Yeah, and then a lot of projects, they start and they don't go anywhere. They uh, either you thought that the data would be good, but then the data is not good enough to answer the question, so you try to salvage it by being creative in writing a different paper for a different audience.
Mm-hmm.
But then you learn, I think. So then those failures are something that you build on and say, I was trying to achieve X, but I only achieved some 20% of X.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the end story, because I have an overall research program which is spanning multiple years. I'll think of this as my first step. And
Mm-hmm.
then I'll take that first step and go to people again, those who rejected me in the beginning, and say, well, now I at least learned this much about your context. Now are you willing to share something more? So it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting journey. And then there are other failures of the kind which you look back and say, I had such a great opportunity and I didn't ask this question.
Mm-hmm.
I asked a research question and I answered a research question that I now think was not ambitious enough.
Mm-hmm.
I had a platform. So sure, I got a publication out of it, or but I could have done something even better. But that's, I guess, like that level of dissatisfaction is constant.
Yeah. And in a way, that's good to have that kind of dissatisfaction. Otherwise, we won't be progressing forward.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So, Sarang sir, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. I mean, this was what I heard about was more about learning in this podcast, and surely it will be a good learning lesson for many of the PhDs who are trying to get into PhD as well as those who are already into the PhD courses. So, thank
Mhm.
you so much.
Thank you, Devendra. I enjoyed our conversation. Best of luck.
Thank you, sir. Friends, this was Professor Sarang from Indian School of Business. He made an important point. If one wants to be a good teacher or even a researcher, he has to be outcome oriented. These outcomes will then drive the process of becoming better at that task. So, here I would like to leave you with a question. As a researcher, what is the outcome that you are looking for when you are taking up any research or teaching assignment? Think about it. With this, I'll say goodbye for now. Have a good day.